Today we're going to be talking about ways to prove a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, and there's 5 ways. The first way is to show both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, and your reason in your proof is going to be definition of a parallelogram. Show that both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. Realize that that's the converse of what we talked about the other day. So your reason would be opposite sides congruent gives a parallelogram. Show one pair of opposite sides are both congruent and parallel. So one pair of sides congruent and parallel gives us a parallelogram. And what I'm giving you guys here is I'm giving you the reasons for our statements. 4, show that both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. Opposite angles. So opposite angles congruent gives us a parallelogram. Show that diagonals bisect each other. Okay, so diagonals bisect gives us a parallelogram. Now realize one thing. Each one of these is the converse of what we did yesterday, except for number 3. Number 3, this same property isn't necessarily true. If these two things are true, it doesn't necessarily, or that isn't necessarily true for a parallelogram. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to prove that statement. So we are given one pair of opposite sides are both congruent and parallel. So I'm going to say WX is parallel to ZY, along with WX being congruent to ZY. So parallel and congruent. Then I need to prove that WX, Y, Z is a parallelogram. And that's my abbreviation for parallelogram. Okay, start off with our given. WX is parallel to ZY, and WX is congruent to ZY. And this we are given. Second statement. Okay. Think about what are some of the ways that I can show something is a parallelogram? Any of those other reasons are something that I can use. If you draw in a line, sometimes you're going to have to draw in something. As long as there's a theorem that justifies, I can draw WY. So I can draw WY. Now what theorem or postulate says that I can do that? Well, 2 points. We know that any 2 points make a line. So that's how I know that I can connect those 2 points to make a line. Now the reason that I did that is I'm going to try and prove the top triangle congruent to the bottom triangle, because I already have sides congruent. I have ZY congruent to WX. Let's name angle X WY angle 1 and WYZ angle 2. So we know that WX is parallel to ZY, so because those are parallel, angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, because parallel lines give us alternate interior angles congruent. Now again, remember, I'm trying to prove that's statement 5. I'm trying to prove triangle WYZ is congruent to triangle, I have to go with y, wx. Think about what we've already said. We've already said one side are congruent. We've said angles are congruent. Now wx, what I'm missing is wy congruent to wy by the reflexive. Now that I know that side is equal, I could say we are congruent by side, angle, side. Okay, now that I know those are congruent, I know that WZ is congruent to XY by CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So now what do we have? We now have opposite sides congruent. So I didn't use the theorem I was trying to prove in my proof, but I used another one that we already knew to be true. So I now know that W, X, Y, Z is a parallelogram and I know that that is a parallelogram because opposite sides congruent gives us a parallelogram. Okay, next example. What values of x and y have to make that quadrilateral a parallelogram? So what do we know about parallelograms? We know the diagonals bisect each other. So I know 3x minus 40 has got to equal x. So if I subtract the 3x over, I have negative 40 equals a negative 2x. X is going to be equal to 20. All right, now solving for y. I know y squared equals y plus 30 because diagonals bisect each other. Solving a quadratic, get one side to be 0. So I subtract the y and the 30 over to one side. Now factor. So I have y minus 6, y plus 5, because they had to be opposite signs because the 30 was negative, but I needed two numbers that were close to each other because they had to add or subtract to be a negative 1. So y can be a 6 or a negative 5. Now 6, that makes sense. Let's see if 5 makes sense. One side would be 5 squared, y squared, which is 25. The other one would be negative 5 plus 30, which also equals 25. So both of these are possible answers. And we found our x to be 20. Okay, next example. We are given that this symbol means parallelogram. So KGLJ is a parallelogram. I know that FK is equal to LH. I need to prove that the red piece, FGHJ, is a parallelogram. Okay, so let's write a paragraph proof. Okay, we are given that KGLJ is a Okay, we're given that it's a parallelogram and FK equals HL. Okay, let's talk about, because it's a parallelogram, because KGLJ is a parallelogram okay, because we are a parallelogram, we know that the diagonals bisect each other. Therefore, O is the midpoint of JG and KL. Since O is the midpoint of KL, OK is going to be equal to LO. We can add congruent parts FK and LH to make OF congruent to OH. Therefore, I'm going to spell therefore up here. Therefore, O is also the midpoint of FH. Because O is the midpoint of both HF or FH and JG, they bisect each other. FH and JG are diagonals of FGHJ. Thus, since diagonals bisect each other, FGHJ is a parallelogram. Okay? So that's how you would prove, using a paragraph proof, how it's a parallelogram. You could also do it in a formal 2-column proof, but the paragraph proof makes this a little bit easier. There is your one lesson question for the day. So solve for values of x and y to make the figure a parallelogram.